You're listening to the Rebel Rebel podcast with Rory Carson. Tasha Vigeshtak, leis an fod curly Rebel Rebel, le Rory McCarson.
Well, folks, welcome along to the second part of my sort of new midweek sessions entitled In Conversation With, and tonight in conversation with the very well-known figure in Republican circles here in West Belfast for many years, Joe Austin. So, Joe, thank you very much.
Rory, thanks for inviting me and thanks for having me in this very important anniversary.
Definitely indeed. So listen, so welcome along to the Rebel Rebel podcast. It's an honour, Joe, to have you in the studio this evening, and to say I know we don't do many of these, so I'm honoured to have you up to them. Actually, so of late you're more used to being the interviewer, and I've seen that the interviewee is part of Scaled It, but we'll go on to that a bit later on after when we're sort of finished talking about the anniversary. So going back a few years, I can always remember you, Joe, from being at parades, demonstrations, election counts, or on TV, and you're always sort of there or thereabouts when we were sort of kids, when we were brought out by the parents. I actually remember sort of when I was really young, you being like manhandled into the back of an RUC Land Rover. Is that outside Colony House? Can you remember there was?
It was. There's one of many occasions. It goes with the job. If you're a Republican in Ireland, certainly in those days, that's what you can expect and more.
Right. So listen, firstly off, tell us a wee bit basically about your basically Republican background as a sort of Republican and a political figure.
Well, I come from North Belfast, which is a very socially deprived working class area. My mother was a mill worker. My father was a docker, a longshoreman. My family don't come from particularly strong Republican roots. They are a nationalist family. They were a nationalist family. And of course, events in the mid-60s changed all of that for thousands and thousands of Republicans on the island of Ireland, very much mimicking the campaign for civil rights and equality that was taking place in America in the mid-60s. young men and women like me decided if only the world knew about injustice, it would be resolved. It would go away. The British government, who ultimately are responsible for the injustice in Ireland, that British government would do the right thing, do the decent thing, and they would set about creating a society that was based on equality. But of course they weren't. And instead of doing what would have resolved some of the problems, possibly not them all, at that time, they unleashed a reign of terror into the communities from which I came. So again, like thousands of young men and young women, you made a decision. You either resisted or you fled. And I, like all those other people, some with us today, some dead, I decided that I would resist, and I've been resisting ever since.
Right, so obviously, as you sort of well know, this past Saturday was the 33rd anniversary of the, sort of dare I say, the public slayings in Gibraltar of 3 unarmed volunteers by SAS, Maria Farrell, Sean Savage and Dan McCann. So to sort of put this into context and to build the story behind this journey, would you have known the 3 volunteers personally before you actually went over to Gibraltar?
I did. I knew all of them. I knew some better than others. But can I, just before we do that, because I'm always very mindful that when we talk about those who have died, that the circumstances sometimes can overshadow the lives that they led. And let me just tell you just a wee bit about Maria Farrell, who was the oldest of the 3, was from West Belfast. She was a trainee teacher. She was at university actually at the time of her execution. She came from a fairly affluent Catholic family in the west of the city. Her father and mother owned a number of small shops. They were a comfortably well-off family. Maria decided at a very early age that she would confront oppression, and she joined the ranks of the Republican movement. She spent long periods of her life in prison. She spent all of her adult life being harassed by British forces of some shape, form or other. Dan McCann was someone who I would have known better than the rest. Excuse me. He lived quite close to where my family home at the time was. He was an active Republican from he was of no age. His family home would have been subjected, and again, like many thousands of other homes, subjected to the regular searches in the middle of the night by the British Army, the wrecking of homes, the destruction of family artefacts, and he would have been subjected to constant harassment. He was a subject of death threats by both the British Army and by their allies in the loyalist community. And he also was fitted up on a charge which put him in prison for 18 months on remand, that is to say, not sentenced. He eventually beat those false charges and was released. And really from that period, he was subject to intense harassment. Sean Savage was a young guy. He had a life to live. He was a keen cyclist. He was a linguist. He was an ardent reader. He had the most investigative mind that I've ever met of a young or older person. Very argumentative and very inquisitive. So they were the people who became those who were assassinated on the Rock of Gibraltar.
Right, so obviously a right bit of emotion there, if you're okay, involved in this. So tell me first about the first sort of phone call or communication you sort of had with the movement regarding what had unfolded at the Rock of Gibraltar.
Well, again, I need to take you back to that period 33 years ago, in the middle of a war, a very intense war between the British government, their allies and the loyalist death squads, and the IRA. And so this was a war that was taking place every day. And Republicans and Republican families, and your own family, were exactly the same. We would have been addicted to news. You'd listen to the news constantly to see what had happened, what was happening, what was going on. And I, like many others, on a Sunday afternoon around about 4 o'clock, had turned on yet another news, and reports were coming in of a gun battle on the Rock of Gibraltar. Gibraltar has a reputation of being almost like a holiday resort. Gibraltar is a fortified outpost of the British Empire, and based on the Rock of Gibraltar, there are three main military installations: the RAF, which is the British Air Force, the British Army, and the British Navy. It's a completely militarised zone. Everything is regulated by what the military require. You get into it going through a border check. You get out of it going through a border check. In the seas around it, it's patrolled by naval vessels, and in the skies above it, it is overseen by British warplanes. My first reaction to the news was that, because it was so far away, and there had been a conflict with Spain and with Basques, I assumed that it may well have been members of ETA, a Basque separatist group. Within a very short period, the dimension of it changed, and it was no longer a gun battle. It was an apprehension of a bomb attack, a pending bomb attack. And my second thought at that stage was that perhaps Palestinians. I didn't really know, but within a relatively quick period, it became clear that the IRA somehow were involved.
Right. So basically, did you get a phone call there? So you up your door and say, "Listen, Joe, me to come and see us here." Was basically.
Really, that is what happened. Someone called who had more knowledge of what had happened to say that the three volunteers in question were Dan, Mairead and Sean. And I knew them all. And I was asked would I go with others to break this news to their families and to make preparations for. And we didn't know what. And at that stage, I have to say, we didn't know who. We were led to believe by the news that there were injuries as well as deaths. So we didn't know who was alive or who was dead. So we began. Belfast is quite small, so the journey didn't take really that long to get to the homes. We began to go around the homes of the three to tell them that there has been an incident. They are involved in it. We don't know at this stage whether your son or daughter, brother or sister is alive or dead.
Right, so obviously then it was decided that yourself and Mairead's brother was going to go over.
Well, initially that wasn't what was decided. Right, okay. What happened was that night we went to visit because we knew it was easy to foretell that for whoever went, families or others, that it would be difficult and it would be complicated to get the resolution of it, to bring the remains home, to do all of that. And we decided that we would go and seek legal advice, and we sought the advice of a well-known Belfast solicitor called pt1 McCrory. We visited him in his home with the representatives of the three families, a number of Republicans, senior Republicans, and we worked on the basis that it was predictable that whoever was going to go was in for a fairly rough ride. Yep. I was asked told, I don't really know how diplomatic you can put it, but I was told I was going to Gibraltar. And it was suggested by the solicitor that I assume the power of attorney, that is to say that I would have the same legal power as the families would have. And that was on the basis that if family members are from one particular family, if they're arrested, then someone could identify the remains of their loved one.
Right, so then, did it sort of, after this happened, how sort of soon we is actually up in the air then?
Well, the following day, we done all the legal work that night, and the following day, in conversations, early the following morning, it was clear that not all of the families were up to travel the distance. Some of the families were in poor health. Some of the parents were in poor health. Some of them were older families. It was clear that all of the families wouldn't be travelling if it could be avoided. And that's when I came into it. So what we began to do was we began to get the kind of things the practical things. So the remains were in Gibraltar. We needed a Gibraltarian undertaker who could look after the remains. We needed to get to Gibraltar. We needed to stay somewhere, not in Gibraltar, but in that general area.
So, well, basically, as you're flying over, right? Obviously, where actually were you flying out to? What airport was it?
We flew from Dublin, and we flew. One of them, Reid Farrell's brothers, had agreed that he would, or volunteered to travel with me. I had the power of attorney for all of the families. He agreed that he would travel with me. We travelled the next day being lunchtime, to Malaga. And from Malaga, the journey to Gibraltar is about 3 hours. So Malaga, there's a Malaga highway that brings you down into Gibraltar. Many people think Gibraltar is an island. Of course, it's not an island. It's attached to Spain. It's part of that Gibraltar corridor. So we flew into Malaga. When we got there, we were confronted by, as you would imagine, hordes of journalists and Spanish Secret Service, accompanied by British MI5 agents. We had in advance, because we knew we had to travel that distance from Malaga down into Gibraltar. We'd hired a car, and when we went to collect the car, the hire company had withdrawn the contract, and so we were effectively stranded at the airport in Malaga.
See, actually, on the flight right going over, what's actually, you probably a bit of time to sort of mull things over. What's going through your head? Like, you're sitting there, I mean, obviously, like, you're sitting there, I mean, on the flight, and you know what you're going over to. So, I mean, what are you thinking about? Like,
well, you don't know what you're going over to. That's the problem. You don't know what you're going into. There is a long Republican tradition that Republican patriot dead, those who have died in the conflicts over generations, don't travel home alone. So, for instance, volunteers who are killed in a countryside are escorted from the local mortuary or the local hospital by Republicans. So Republicans don't go home alone. A wee bit like formal armies. You've seen funerals, military funerals in America or elsewhere, and you'll see coffins that are escorted by guards of honour and escorted by other soldiers of the same nationality. So it was agreed for those reasons that's what we would do. So the question you're asking me, we just did not know what to expect. We had no idea. We didn't know whether or not we would be arrested. We didn't know whether or not we would be allowed to reclaim the bodies, claim the bodies, identify the bodies. We had no idea. This was completely new territory for Republicans.
So, see, when you got there, obviously, was the press there as well at the airport as soon as you arrived? Did they have prior knowledge you're coming over? Or?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And we later discovered how they had prior knowledge. When we arrived there was a press scrum. On the flight over, it was clear that the flight attendants and others knew who we were. They didn't give us any difficulties, but they kind of knew who we were. When we got to the airport and we tried to go through customs, we were halted and stopped and all of that. We were made aware by the Spanish customs authorities that there was a large gathering of press outside, and we were offered the opportunity of going out a back door or putting a blanket over our heads or whatever kind of disguise was feasible, and we obviously refused them all. So when we got out, we went through the scrum of the press, we went to collect the car had been rescinded, we were stranded. We then started trying to make plan B, hard to get from Malaga down to Gibraltar. We were then approached by a guy within the ranks of the security grouping that were there. There were customs officials, there were Spanish police, there were plainclothes police, there were obviously the Spanish equivalent of the CIA and people like that. And this guy identified himself as an English Home Office official, which really meant he was a member of MI5. And he said he could resolve the issue of the car. And I think we told him, well, get it resolved then. And he went away and he came back to say that the car had been released. Now, that wasn't really out of the goodness of his heart, though it was helpful. But it was so that they were able to monitor what car we were in, where we were going, and how we were going there.
Is this the guy that you had mentioned that sort of popped up at every sort of event that happened in the course of the...
This guy was with us the whole duration of the Gibraltar experience, and he popped up at the undertakers and then within the military mortuary and all this stuff. So he was clearly a high-ranking official of MI5. So we left the airport with a contingent of press, cops, and interested parties following us like a convoy. Maria's brother was driving the car. We headed straight to the border checkpoint at Gibraltar. And there is a dispute between Gibraltar and Spain, and so you have this constant lane of traffic trying to get into Gibraltar from Spain, and another lane of traffic trying to get out of Gibraltar into Spain. Right. So there's always this log jam at the border crossing. We joined that log jam, and very soon we were approached by the head of the Gibraltarian police, who walked down through the lane and indicated for our car to pull out. And we then drove into Gibraltar. By this stage, I think it was probably about 7, 8 o'clock at night. It was dark, just beginning to get dark. And while we drove in, and we were shepherded into a customs post that was absolutely packed with officials, police, Gibraltarian civil administrators, all sorts of people who had statutory responsibility for Gibraltar. And they asked us, they actually demanded that we sign the Official Secrets Act. And of course we refused to sign it, and there was some confusion about it. There was some delay in processing us. And then they came back to say that the remains were being held in a naval mortuary inside the Rock of Gibraltar. The Rock of Gibraltar, over many centuries, has been tunnelled through. And during the Second World War, it was used as a shelter for German bombing. And at this stage, those corridors carved out of rock had now became hospitals and different military installations, or in this case, RAF administration. So that meant that we had to leave from the border post under escort up into this mortuary, this RAF mortuary that was in the middle of the rock. So
was there any hostility of you actually getting in to the rock? I mean, the mountain where the mortuary was.
There was two sets of difficulties that you face constantly. The Gibraltarians who are there pride themselves on the fact that they're English. Anybody's been to Gibraltar, there are permanent Union Jacks displays. It's a very pro-British colony. It's a very, the police in Gibraltar dress like English bobbies. The pubs are based on English pubs. It's full of British soldiers on furlough. It's all of that. So there, obviously a convoy of cars that are heading through a place. They're very narrow streets and they're very hilly streets. So you weren't going at any given speed, and it was very restricted. So everywhere you went, you were confronted by hostile crowds and people giving abuse and so on.
So did you actually bump into any locals on the sort of journey into this that give you any? Was there any shouting, spitting or anything? Or
no, we were in a car, so we weren't out. We did have some hostility, but not at this stage. When we got to the naval base, which is carved into the Rock of Gibraltar, we again were confronted with this. These are military installations, so we were confronted with this need to sign Official Secrets Act, British Official Secrets Act. We're Irish. I'm an Irish Republican. I spent my life not being British, so I wasn't going to commit myself to British secret restrictions. So we refused again, and at that stage we were delayed and held up at the gate, just inside the perimeter of it, until some daft naval officer decided that he was going to make us sign these or else we weren't getting in. So it became a wee bit of a battle of wits, and we won, and we didn't sign it, and we were brought to the entrance to the mortuary. It had been agreed on the way over that I would identify the remains. We knew that there was multiple gunshots, so we didn't know how how bad the gunshots were, how disfiguring the gunshots may have been. I have to say that this is an important feature of all of this about Gibraltar, and people need to bear in mind as they listen to this. What happened on Gibraltar was that these volunteers were surrounded, captured and executed. There wasn't a gun battle. They weren't fleeing the scene. They weren't hiding in bushes. They were captured. They were surrounded. They effectively they couldn't go anywhere. So the gunshots were within feet, rather than firing down streets or firing at any sort of distance. So we knew that the wounds would be severe. We worked out the wounds would be severe. So we had agreed that I would identify the remains. So at the tunnel that led into the mortuary, I advised Mairead's brother that he should stay, and I, accompanied by a naval guard, not guarding me, by the way, guarding their installation, started down these tunnels, which were hundreds of feet long, more, maybe thousands of feet long. They were, I suppose, about maybe 8 foot high, carved out of the rock that makes up the famous Rock of Gibraltar. That's how they were carved, and they were lit by badly lit line of lights down through the ceiling. So they were quite dim, quite dull, quite misty, kind of hard to see and all of that. In fact, as we were going down, we were stopped for some unknown reason, and I seen shadows coming towards me. And to be honest, it looked initially like it was a giant magpie, right, coming down one of these corridors that led on to this main corridor we were on. It turned out it was a monk dressed in black and white, as monks do, and he was running, and the sleeves of this habit were flapping. He was the chaplain to the mortuary. He asked could he accompany me, and I said no, and he stepped back. We went on in to a very small mortuary, and I began the task of identifying, first of all, Don, who had been stripped of his clothes and wrapped in polythene, heavy duty polythene, and then Sean, who was on the floor, again stripped of his clothes and wrapped in polythene, heavy duty polythene. Their wounds were severe. I asked where Mairead was and was led into a room off this central room, and Mairead was on a bed with a white sheet pulled up to her chin. To humanise it, there were candles burning around where her body was. She had a mark on her nose. And I asked how that, as well as the gunshot wounds, she had no gunshot wounds to her face, but I had asked how this injury had occurred, and was told that it possibly happened when she was propelled by the bullets onto the pavement. What happened was when Don and Mairead were shot, Don was in front of Mairead, sheltering Mairead. They obviously had realised that they were unarmed. They had realised that they were going to be approached by these individuals who they had identified as being undercover of some sort. And Don and Mairead put their hands up, and the guy pulled a weapon. This is according to eyewitnesses. And Don then shielded Mairead, and Don was shot. And when Don was shot, immediately Mairead was shot. So this happened. Sean Savage had split from Don and Mairead and had heard the shooting, had tried to go. You can't get off the rock, there's only one way in the border crossing. Had tried to go in deeper into the Rock of Gibraltar. A second, possibly a third squad of undercover agents had pursued him, and they shot him close by.
So obviously, I've heard saying that you let you approached Mairead's brother and thought it would be an idea for him to go and basically identify Mairead.
What happened was when I had done the formal identification, I came out to tell Maria's brother what had happened, and I said to him, "Look, I think you should go in and see her. I think you should. She isn't. Facially, she isn't badly injured. I think you should." And obviously, his reluctance was nothing to do with the love for his sister. He was just so emotional and heartbroken and all that. And I also told him of the encounter with the monk, the padre. And I said to him, "Look, we're here representing the families, and the families of the three who I had known were quite religious people." And I said, and I'm not. I said, in my opinion, I think they would appreciate that prayers were said over them. And I don't really think they would mind as to who was saying them, from what religion, but I think they would appreciate that. And he agreed. So he went back in, I went closely behind him. He spent on his own some time with Maria, and then we asked this padre to join with us, and so there was a senior naval officer who was close by but not intrusive, and there was the padre, and there was Maria's brother and myself. One of the interesting things that happened continually over that period, over that whole period of being there, was everybody of any official status that we met all denied any responsibility. So from the very first encounter with the chief constable to the last encounter, they told us it wasn't us. These people came from England and they carried out the killings and they left. They left within an hour. So that was that was their mindset, that even those who consider themselves to be professional, whether it be naval personnel, army personnel, RAF personnel or police, all were quite anxious to make sure that they could not be identified as being part of it.
Right, folks, so we're going to take a break now from the interview, and we'll basically play a song. We're going to play one as well at the end of the episode. So obviously it is International Women's Day today, so it is. So obviously we've just been sitting talking about Maria Farrell, so we're going to do this time the Ballad of Maria Farrell. Obviously a track written by Shanaghy and the Unity Squad from New York. So there's loads and loads of different versions this year. I actually played Emer McLachlan's version yesterday on the live show. So now I'm going to play a good friend of mine, Cara McCann, who I've known for many years, who's a very, very strong woman. So this is her version of the Ballad of Maria Farrell.
Do not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there, I do not sleep. Do not stand at my grave and cry while our land lives. I do not die. A woman's place is not at home. The fight for freedom still goes on. I took up my gun until freedom's day and pledged to fight for the IRA in Armagh jail. I spent my time. Strip searches were a British crime, degraded me, but they could not see I'd suffer this to see Ireland free. Gibraltar was the place I died. McCann and not stand at my grave and weep. I am not there, I do not sleep. Do not stand at my grave and cry while our land lives. I do not die while our land lives. I do not die.
There you go, folks, the ballad of Maria Fowler for you from the beautiful Cara McCann. Right, so Joe, obviously, I'm thinking that after you have identified the bodies, you're probably sort of knowing at this stage it's going to be a bit of a long, drawn-out process. It's not going to be a case of, right, get them into the plane, get them home. Firstly, they just need to go and find somewhere to stay then.
Yeah, but I know that's the sequel of events, and it's important that you understand that. But it's also important that we all kind of understand some of the backdrop to it. The British government and the British Army and their supporters have been assassinating Republicans in Ireland since the Irish occupation. So it's not new. This activity is not new. What was different in Gibraltar was that this was a Sunday afternoon in full view of dozens of tourists,